now let me turn to Romilly. Romilly is a research fellow in Cape here at ODI. She specialised in aid and development finance issues, and of course is the real organiser and heart of this conference, so it's good to have you on the platform as well. Romilly's worked before that for DFID, where she worked not least on the Aid Transparency Initiative and on DFID's own aid effectiveness policies. She's worked in other places as well, including 4 years with Action Aid UK in Cambodia, where she was involved in advocacy and research on aid and debt, so bringing great background to this. Romilly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. And as Richard said, I was one of the key people organising this conference, and therefore I've realised I've made a strategic mistake in placing myself last on the programme after a very heavy presentation-heavy day. So I will try and be as quick as possible, because I'm sure everyone is tired and keen to get through the day and get on to the drinks party. I'm going to complement some of what Marianne has said, drawing on... Oh, sorry, I need to get... Can you put my presentation up? Sorry, I got a bit overexcited there. I'm going to complement some of what Marianne has said, drawing on some research that myself and a team of others at ODI have been doing on the whole issue of complex flows, as we call them, so the new flows, although of course some of them are not new, but new flows and new actors at country level. And that's a paper that we're going to be finalising towards the end of the year and publishing probably early next year. So this is very much the preliminary findings of that research. Firstly, why look at this topic? Well, as we know, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation includes as one of the core elements the engagement of new actors, and that includes, as we've discussed a lot today, non-DAC donors, philanthropy, climate finance actors, private sector, and so on. But why do this study particularly? Well, we felt this is important because we really wanted to focus on the country level perspective and priorities. There's a lot of literature out there on many of these topics, but very little of it actually focuses on what countries want and what countries see as their priorities when it comes to managing these new flows. We also wanted to start with a neutral starting point vis-à-vis the aid effectiveness agenda. So we didn't necessarily want to go there and say, to what extent are these new actors complying with Paris and Accra? We wanted to go with a fairly open slate to ask countries what they saw as the really important priorities. Just a minor point, the literature, when we reviewed the literature, showed that there was this big gap and that we needed to do this research. What did we include in our definition of this complex flows? Essentially, many of the things that we've been talking about today, things that we also call aid-like flows, so they are not purely private, they're provided with some kind of public interest purpose, with some level of concessionality, not on purely private terms. And so up here you can see some of the categories that we included in that definition. And this just gives you a very quick overview of the mapping of how we envisage these flows actually getting down to the country level. Now, one of the things that we've tried to do is to quantify some of these flows, and I think this links very much to the earlier discussions we had about the ODA definition. If we were to expand the ODA definition, my guess is that these are some of the things that we might look at starting off with. Now, I do want to emphasize these figures are very tentative. We want to do more work, and we would like to have feedback from people in this room about what should we include, what should we not include. So I think, as our Chinese colleague said earlier, please don't start quoting these figures around the place, but we will be having final figures when we do finish the paper. So we looked at two scenarios, one slightly more conservative and one slightly less conservative. The difference between those two scenarios is really around DFIs and around climate finance. DFIs, we weren't quite clear on to what extent some of that funding is concessional versus non-concessional, so we've included it in our optimistic forecast and not in our less optimistic. Climate finance, despite what Andrew was saying earlier, we did find it quite difficult to work out how much of climate finance is public climate finance is potentially concessional versus non-concessional. So that accounts for the ranges we've got in climate finance. But what our tentative figures suggest at the moment is that ODA could, in the lower case scenario, make up about 80% of these total flows, and in the upper case scenario, make up about 60% of the total flows. So the order of magnitude is potentially relatively significant. So we then went to do some case study research in 3 countries, in Cambodia, Ethiopia, and Zambia. We looked at these 3 countries because our preliminary data analysis suggested that they were going to be fairly typical countries in terms of the volume of these new flows. And also we wanted to get a regional balance, a mixture in terms of fragility, non-fragile, middle income, and so on and so forth. And this just gives you an indication, again, these are preliminary figures of the volume of the new flows that we found at country level. This is Cambodia, which had the largest volume of the new, when I say new in inverted commas, flows. This is a lot to do with China. China is a very, very big donor in Cambodia. So as you can see there, the flows, the non-traditional flows have been increasing quite substantially. Less so in Ethiopia, and even less so actually in Zambia. We found that the volume of these new flows in Zambia was really pretty low. So what did we find from these case studies? Basically 5 main messages, and I'll just present an overview of the messages and then I'll go into them in more detail. Firstly, I think this chimes with what Marianne has just said, we did find that the countries felt that more choice and more finance was very welcome. We found that the non-DAC donors particularly scored well in terms of ownership, alignment and speed. We found that countries were actually taking quite a strategic approach to how they manage these new opportunities. Contrary to what we were talking about in the last session, we actually found that philanthropy and social impact investment were fairly small and embryonic. And interestingly, we found very limited interest in Cambodia and Ethiopia in including new actors in aid coordination mechanisms. So I'll go into each of those points in a little bit more detail. So firstly, more choice and more finance was welcome. There tends to be quite a lot of concern when talking about new flows about fragmentation. Is it, is it going to make the challenges of aid effectiveness much worse, much more difficult? But actually in all of the countries, as Marianne was saying, they said more finance is really a critical priority, and that fragmentation wasn't really raised as a concern in any of our interviews. Cambodia, interestingly, they talked about the fact that new actors could finance projects at a lower rate of return than some of the traditional donors. So they were then able to finance, for example, provincial roads, whereas actually donors like the Asian Development Bank could only finance the main roads. Now, of course, that's a double-edged sword because you're then potentially financing projects with a lower rate of return that could potentially have impacts on ability to repay loans and so on. But that was quite an interesting finding. And in fact, in none of the countries was there any concern about debt sustainability. All of them are rated low debt distress, according to the IMF and World Bank. Some of them have had HIPC debt relief, but there certainly didn't seem to be a lot of concern. And certainly Ethiopia, there was no example of them turning down loans because of issues around concessionality. When we asked countries about what they really felt were important priorities when it came to both traditional and new donors, perhaps unsurprisingly, ownership and alignment came out as very strong priorities. These are obviously core parts of the Paris agenda. Very interestingly, speed also came up as a really, really critical priority in I think, all of the countries. And it was found that actually the non-DACs tended to score quite well in terms of alignment, mainly because of their contribution to infrastructure and the promotion of economic growth, whereas the DAC donors tended to be much more focused on the social sectors. So countries like Cambodia that actually had underfunding previously in infrastructure sectors were feeling that these new donors were really filling in that gap. We did find some more challenges with health funds like the Global Fund and some of the philanthropic funds around harmonisation and alignment, that in some countries they weren't quite so well aligned with government priorities in the health sector. So there was a slightly different story between the non-DACs and some of the global funds. We did find, which again I think chimes with what Marianne said, we did find that countries are taking quite a strategic approach and are in some cases using the existence of new sources of financing to play a slightly stronger hand with traditional donors. I think this was most evidenced in Ethiopia, where they have a very clear strategy of saying we prefer concessional financing, we prefer budget support. If that's taking too long or it's too burdensome, we'll move on to the non-concession or the less concessional. If that's too difficult, we'll move on to domestic resource mobilization or purely private flows. So they have a very strategic approach. In Cambodia, there was some evidence that funds from China were really bolstering the confidence of the government in dealing with traditional donors, so conditionality being less easy to implement. Cambodia had cancelled their biannual Cambodia Development Cooperation Forum, where they're supposed to review progress against conditionalities, and some interviewees suggested that that was partly to do with the influence of China. As I mentioned, we found that philanthropic and the social impact flows were very small, and particularly on the social impact side, we found that people weren't very aware of it, and if they were aware of it, they tended to see it very much similarly to private flows and not in the same category as ODA. But the small volume of philanthropy was quite a surprise to us, to be honest. For example, I think in Zambia we found that US foundations had provided an average of less than $1 million per year over the past roughly a decade, compared to ODA, which was $1 billion. Now that's a fairly extreme example, but in none of the countries did we find a very significant volume of philanthropic flows. We don't, however, count philanthropic funds that may go through, for example, the Global Fund or other mechanisms, so that may be partly what's happening. But I found that was quite interesting. And then the final point on aid coordination mechanisms, and this is slightly different to what Marianne said. Certainly in Ethiopia and Cambodia, there wasn't a lot of interest from government in including the new actors in these mechanisms. Sometimes they did attend in some fairly limited capacity, but in Cambodia, when we interviewed government, none of them could really find a reason to involve the new actors in these mechanisms. Zambia, slightly different story, but I found that very interesting in both the Ethiopian and Cambodian cases. So, mindful of time, just some conclusions from this research. Firstly, as I said, we still need to confirm the numbers, but the complex flows, as we call them, are potentially quite sizable in relation to ODA. We did find that countries are welcoming the choice, and they are being quite strategic in how they're managing flows from the limited study that we did. Although, so we, in general, seem to be more positives than negatives. Interestingly, the suggestion is that traditional donors may find themselves less popular, and they could find it more difficult to implement conditions. And I do think this issue of the exclusion of new donors from aid coordination mechanism is potentially a challenge to the aid effectiveness agenda. Certainly in Ethiopia, we found that in some of the aid coordination mechanisms where the non-DAC donors weren't involved because they weren't being invited around infrastructure, for example, the government often wouldn't engage either, and that these groups actually became more or less useless because none of the key players were actually participating. But the final point to note is that this is only based on 3 countries. They are quite diverse countries, and I think we'd be really keen to do more research to get a wider perspective on these findings. Thank you.